So Penn discusses a really interesting way to bring home the reality of what we're doing when we're making political choices and voting in a certain way, and to see specifically how those choices play out in the use of force, which is not something that we normally think about. Governments have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, he says. And in a representational democracy like our own, that means that anything that we vote to allow governments to use force to do should also be things that we would be willing to use force to do if we weren't cowards, as he said, if we had the right to, in other words. Now, taxation is a use of force because if you don't pay your taxes, someone eventually with a gun is going to settle the situation in one way or another. So that fact forces Penn to think about what uses of my tax money would I be willing personally to ensure happen at the point of a gun. Now that's kind of a mind-blowing way to think about things, but it really brings home the reality of what we're doing. And that's why I thought it would be so helpful with this assignment. So he discusses, would I be willing to gun personally to stop someone from being killed? And he says, yeah, I think I would. And would I be willing to use a gun personally to stop someone from being raped? And he seems to say, yes, he would. Then he says, would I be willing personally to use a gun to force others to build a library? And he pauses, and I'm not sure if he would. Maybe not. Now, if the answer to any of these is no or I'm not sure, Penn's point is that we shouldn't make political choices and vote for things that would empower other people to use guns to enforce those things. So using this logic, and the reason why that logic is important is because it highlights, let me put it this way. Normally, I wouldn't be forcing you to be thinking about gun use, and that's not what I'm about. But the reason I am here is that it forces you to weigh some of the issues, particularly when it comes to the liberty oppression moral foundation, which is why Penn is discussing this, by the way, because he's a libertarian, and that libertarians take seriously that foundation over some others, right? So the point is that it brings in relief some more issues than we would normally think if we think about it in this way. So using the 6 foundations that you learned about, and I have below a great link for, as I mentioned, as a summary of those if you want to remind yourself. What I'm going to have you do is look at some of these debates below and analyze them in terms of the possibility space, how different people might look at the same moral debate, and depending on which moral foundation they draw on, would say, yeah, I would be willing at the point of a gun to require someone to do X, or maybe a completely different argument, a different perspective, in a completely different way. I think I would be willing to use the point of a gun to ensure that Y happens, and then X and Y aren't necessarily the same things. Or I don't think I would be willing to do this at the point of a gun. So that's what's really interesting. It's going to open up possibilities. And I've given some examples below. I'll have you look at those. I do get that this is a complicated idea, that what I'm asking you to do. So I understand if it's a little complicated, but I hope the examples, I've given you 2 different examples that will help you understand it. I hope, I've also mentioned 3 hints below. They're important. I'm going to mention 2 of them. One is understand that every one of these, I don't believe that there is any unanimous right or wrong for these situations. There is only the weighing of different moral imperatives. That's the whole point of moral foundations theory. It's never a no-brainer. There's always something that has to be pitted against something else. And for you, darn it, you know the way it should go for you. But other people would look at it, and because if they're relying on a different moral foundation and think it's important, would make the opposite conclusion. And so that's the take-home point. And the other thing I'll note that I do mention below is this. It's actually easier to be objective and come up with different ways to think about that same moral issue if you're not invested in it. Because if you're invested in it, you're used to only seeing it your way, or only seeing it in the way of the moral community from which you see it by. And it makes it really hard to step outside of that framework, which was part of the point of the app that you were doing this week. So if you are choosing an issue that you feel like you have a vested interest in it, you need to work hard to step outside and to see what the moral issues might be from someone else's perspective. And as I mentioned before, you don't have to divulge your hand. I'm not asking you to say what is the right issue and argue it and get in a debate with your peers. What I am asking you to do is do a good job trying to figure out all the sides to it. And then your peers are going to look at what you did and say, you know, one thing I think you missed, or another way of looking at it, relying on a different moral foundation would have been. In other words, you're going to have a discussion about it, but from the kind of helicopter view of the different moral foundations that could be invoked.